Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Treniques, presented by Find Your ID New York City, a global creative agency, effective brand development, event production, and talent management. Treniques is live on Facebook and YouTube every Thursday at 8 p.m., featuring different talent from the creative industry. You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Find Your ID New York City. Tonight, we have Brian Edsall, who is a 25-year-old portrait photographer based in Brooklyn, New York City. So, hi, Brian. How are you?
Hey, how's it going? How are you?
Good. Thanks. We're excited to have you today. So tell us a little bit about what you're gonna show us today.
Obviously with photography, everyone kind of knows the whole process of going to a shoot, planning out a shoot, but there's so much that happens after that in terms of post-shot processing. So vetting through the images, editing, delivering to your clients. So there's a whole back half portion to photography that is kind of behind the scenes and people don't really know about. But that's kind of what we're going to be covering off on today.
Right. Okay. So I'm gonna let you start your presentation. And yeah, thank you for coming on Triniques tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much. As you were saying, I'm a 25-year-old portrait photographer based in Brooklyn. I've been shooting for about 2 years now, and I've had experience working in New York Fashion Week shows, editorial publications, and things such as that. As I was saying before, a lot of what we know about photography is planning the photo shoot itself, but there's so much editing and processing that goes in after that shoot ends. And really want to take you through that process. And it's a really important process to, developing yourself as a professional photographer. And if you're not a photographer, working with one, in the industry. So before we get started, the big thing is that if you do have a shoot with clients, you really want to set expectations in terms of delivery time, how many photos they should expect. That really just lays the boundary for, pricing and timing, and that way the client isn't curious as to when they're going to be getting their final product. I always advise photographers against giving unedited images to any clients. The way that I look at it is that your work is kind of like your name tag. So when there's work that goes out there that's unedited, then people kind of do their own editing to it, and then associate your name with it. That kind of dilutes your brand, it dilutes your image. So really, again, just setting that expectation of, you're the professional, you're going to be going through these photos, looking for any like minor mistakes, whether it be blurriness or, things getting caught up in the background or things such as that. I'll kind of walk you through that process pretty quickly. And then, as you kind of go through the photos that you took during the shoot, depending on how many, if it was like an hour-long shoot or 2-hour-long shoot, you may have 100, 200, upwards of like 500 photos, depending on how you take the photos. A great thing that I love to advise people in terms of gear is really investing in an external hard drive. When I first started photography, I was kind of looped into a lot of these places like Apple, for example, right? Like they'll try to sell you their laptops with the greatest amount of storage because, you're a photographer and your photos are going to take up a lot of storage. So, that extra few gigabytes of storage can cost you up to hundreds, if not like 500 or plus dollars. Meanwhile, I have this external hard drive here. It's about 2 terabytes, which is way more than any laptop is going to hold. And it cost me less than $100. That's advice that I got from other photographers as I was getting my gear to be more professional. So just a heads up for that in terms of how you should actually start processing your images. So kind of to take you through what my process looks like when I first come back from the shoot, I immediately upload to my external hard drive, make sure it's backed up, and then I start kind of doing that initial vetting process. So I've actually set up a example for you all tonight in terms of, what I kind of go through as these photos are being set up. So let me just share my screen now. So I have your Find Your ID test here. So basically, when I come into, these photos that I first took, these are all the photos that I've laid out. They're every single one from the shoot. This test, is just a sample of like 20 images or so. But as you scroll through here, you'll kind of see these like red dots next to my images. And basically what I like to do before I even get into any type of editing software is making sure I'm kind of going through the images and doing that pre-vetting process, looking out for any photos that I may not necessarily be a big fan of, but also technically, like, are these photos blurry? You know, is the arm positions in a weird place? Are there distractions in the background? And one great tip of advice that I always try to give photographers who are first starting out is, in a digital age, we're very much sold on this new trend of digital photography and post-processing and like Photoshop and things like that, to remove distractions and, you know, blemishes and whatever it may be. But I always say, you know, it's always worth taking 30 seconds or like a minute to make minor adjustments while you're shooting in the moment versus spending an extra half hour trying to take out those distractions later on in post-processing. This is going to save you a lot of time, a lot of energy, and it's really not worth it. And that way you can really only use Photoshop for, you know, the most crucial things in terms of editing out from your image. So if it's windy and your model's hair is blowing in her face, but she's not realizing it, you know, just take that 5 seconds to tell her, oh, your hair's right there, you know, get out of your face, and she'll adjust, and then you move on with the shoot. So like I was saying before, I like to kind of do like a quick look at some of my images before ultimately uploading them into Lightroom. So we'll see here, you know, this is one of the images I selected. Basically, I'll be looking for focus. So is the image pretty clear on the face? Because this is full body, that's not as crucial, but you can see there's not many distractions in the background. Actually, during the shoot, there was a huge pile of trash that I made sure was not in the shot as I was angling the model. Same thing with, you know, these type of shots are pretty similar, different position, but kind of the same style concept of shot. And basically, you know, as I work through it, we'll go through and see some of the images that I didn't select. So you're taking a lot of shots, you know, your model's obviously a human, so she's going to be blinking, breathing, moving. You know, right here, I got her caught in the middle of blinking. So a very clear image, but, you know, obviously will not be part of the final product. Also, things you can look out for is just like shadowing or harsh lighting. For example, you know, this photo that I'm going to be showing you in terms of the pose itself, like I really loved. But actually, before I even noticed, when she leaned back, there was harsh lighting that you can see that kind of cuts off half of her body. And when you're editing and like looking at an image quickly, that can like really define body shape. So I had her kind of move, get more into the shadows. When you're shooting, you always want to try to avoid like some really harsh sunlight, especially if it's like partially on the body. It's not really flattering in terms of like defining a person's actual shape. And then, you know, we'll go through some of these other images as well, things I look for. So I had this really cool pose that I wanted her to do against this flat wall. Again, this image is, you know, technically a pretty great image. It's very clear, it's sharp. The thing that I didn't like about this image is that the way I angled myself, you can't see her other arm. So it kind of looks like she's missing an arm in the shot, which, you know, again, I didn't think of the angle as at the time that I was taking it, but going through post-processing, you kind of take a sharper look at those small details. So yeah, I mean, basically, those are things you kind of want to look out for as you're going through the initial vetting process. Again, sometimes you can have hundreds of photos, but the thing that's nice is that with the external hard drive, it doesn't back up your computer too much. And as you vet them, you know, you can really select the ones that are your top priorities once you're going into things like Lightroom and those editing softwares. So basically, once I've done this and I've kind of selected, you know, let's say I'm delivering 25 images to my client ultimately. Maybe I'll select like 40 to 50 to go into Lightroom to really, really look at those finer details and narrow them down. And the great thing with a lot of editing software is that they will also have like rating systems. So you can kind of go through and, you know, rate them in that software as well. So you'll see here that, you know, I'll do a sort by, I'll go by, you know, tags. So it'll group all the photos that I tagged up at the top, which makes it super, super easy to, you know, import into my software. So we'll go here to Lightroom. Basically, you know, I'll just import. It'll take a second here. But yeah, so I'll see on my desktop. I'll go to the FYID photo shoot. We'll see, you know, these are all the images that are in the folder, but I may only want to select the ones that I had teed off in the beginning. So a good process to do also as well, if you want, is going back to the folder. If you do have them backed up and these are now on your desktop, actually just deleting those temporary files. So once you go in there, all these will be gone. But for the sake of this presentation, these are only 20 or so images. So I'm just going to quickly upload them right now. So you'll see it'll take a second. But it's really important, like I was saying before, as you're kind of going through this process, there are going to be a lot of images. A lot of images are going to be very similar. And what I always try to prioritize when I ultimately do deliver these final images is how are the images that I'm delivering different from one another? So if there are two that are very close, like you'll even see here, like this image is pretty close to this image. And they might both be really, really great shots. It could just be my own mood that I'm feeling, like, do I like her facial expression more, or is there something about the shadowing or whatever it may be that will ultimately lead me to selecting the final image? But kind of walking you through this brief editing process. Now, editing can be an entire presentation on its own, and everyone has their own style. So I'm certainly not going to preach like a certain way that you should be editing. My personal philosophy with any type of editing is to be very minimal, to be very realistic to the actual image itself, which goes back to kind of trying to make sure that everything is right in frame versus having to do anything post-shoot in Photoshop. But, there's a whole wide array of people with their creative philosophies and how they like to edit. So that is not what I'm going to be teaching, but I will be going over some very basic ways that you can edit your images and improve the quality of them in this process. So, Lightroom, I don't know if you're all familiar with it, but it's part of the Adobe suite. So it's really meant to be kind of a watered down version of Photoshop, where things are very straightforward. It's meant for that more quick editing processing. I always like to start off with my lens corrections. So to give you an idea, every single lens has some type of distortion based on the millimeters, based on the focal length and things like that. So for example, a 35 millimeter might distort the image in terms of making it give that like fisheye effect that you've seen on social media where the image is kind of curved. That's because the lens curve itself gives that effect naturally. So the cool thing with Lightroom is that it'll actually kind of correct for that natural lens curve on its own. So you'll see here, you can see how it kind of like brightens. That's because in the lens that I took it in, which is an 85 millimeter, not a whole lot of distortion, but it will get rid of that kind of shadowing, in the background. So that is always the first thing I do. The second thing I do, there's a whole bunch of different tools here, but I always like to increase my sharpening. This is very minor, but it will kind of increase like the small details in the image just by a bit, which is really great. In terms of things like noise reduction, you're going to be wanting to use this if you're in a dark light setting and you raise some of your settings that are increasing that graininess. It'll actually smooth out your image a little bit and help you out there. I don't really go too much into split toning, but again, back to the whole creative style, like this is a really, really great way to kind of stylize your images. So just to give you a little overview of what this would look like. So things like highlights or shadows, you can actually add color to. So let's say, I want to add, a reddish tone to the saturation of the highlights. So you can see here, her skin is kind of getting more red. And as I adjust the color, it changes all of the highlights. Again, it's all based on kind of your own personal preference in terms of what style you're going for. And the cool thing is that with Lightroom, once you kind of find out your style and the way that you like to edit your images as a whole, you can save down these presets that you'll kind of see on the left side for future use. So that'll also speed up your post-shot processing. But I'm going to keep that down for now. I really don't touch that too much in my editing. Same thing with the HSL. So the hue, the saturation, the luminance, these are all adjustments to the colors of your images. So to give you a cool idea, her skin doesn't have any type of greens. What's cool is that it'll actually have an eyedropper that'll show you like what colors are shown here. So I have it on a sports bra, it's highlighting the orange. I go over to the green, it highlights the green. And you can make adjustments based on how you kind of want to tweak those colors. Sometimes based on the setting, Maybe you're underneath a lot of trees, so the light coming through is going to be green, and that might make their skin appear to have like a greenish hue. So this is really great for kind of adjusting those colors. But to give you an example, so there's green tiles in the background. As I adjust these, it completely changes the color. So maybe I'm going for like this funky turquoise look. Maybe I'm going for like this all yellow look. It's pretty cool to mess around with. Same thing with the blues. You'll see that blue square in the background, give it more turquoise, or go over to the right and give it more of a violet look. Again, I try to stick to the natural colors, but this is all things that you can kind of mess around with. So basically what I kind of stick to is these basic settings here. So exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, whites, blacks, texture, clarity, vibrance, things like that. Those are all your pretty standard adjustments for any image. And to give you any reference, if you're looking at this and you're like, this looks like a foreign language to me, basically all I did was kind of dove right in, mess around with it, and watch YouTube videos. I did not take any formal classes on this. I did not like pay for anything formally. Kind of just messed around and found out what I liked and how I liked images to look. Think of it as a more hyper version of editing that you have on like Instagram or apps like that. Just playing around with it and kind of seeing what you like. And that's really all you have to do to find your creative look and feel. So the first things that I'll always do, I'll increase contrast a little bit to increase the distinction between shadow and light. I'll increase the exposure a little bit so you can see the whole entire image kind of gets a little bit brighter here. What you'll see in the background is that the highlights are pretty bright. She kind of doesn't pop out. So I might want to decrease these. You know, I'll play around with it and see. You can see the background's kind of getting a little bit darker. So I'll see around 30 is a good area to have it. Shadows, you can kind of see in things like her hair is, you know, pretty dark. You can't really see the texture. I like there to be a little bit of texture while maintaining some of that shadow. So you'll see as I increase it, you know, the texture in her hair is coming out a little bit more. And as you adjust these things, you know, like shadows and highlights, you'll kind of see that it might start getting too bright or too dark. And you can always go back to like exposure, take it down a little bit, and lower that, you know. Things like whites is kind of like the shininess on her skin. If I go all the way down, you can see like how that kind of takes it away. I always like there to be like a contrast, so I'll increase that a little bit. Blacks, I'll decrease a little bit. And showing you before and after here, you can kind of see how the image is kind of coming together. Temperature, again, kind of your creative style, but it messes around with kind of like the overall tone. Generally, if you're going for an artistic style, cool gives off that like sad, kind of darker feel, while warm gives off that like summery, brighter, happy feel. I tend to only increase warmness a little bit. I do like my images to be a little bit brighter, just to give it that like warmer feel. Same thing, texture and clarity is kind of like the details. So if I really take these up all the way, you can kind of see like her skin is really texturized. But if you decrease it, it gives it that like airy feel, which maybe if you're going for like a dreamy styled look or something like that, that could be a great adjustment to make your image. I always like to increase these just a little bit, just to give the image a little bit more pop. Again, you can kind of see how it's not many major edits, but you know, it makes a little bit of difference in terms of bringing out the detail, bringing out the colors, and things like that. Now we purposely chose this location because of this colorful background. So I do want to make sure that these colors are popping. So I'll increase the vibrance. Again, if you know, increase that a lot, can see it's pretty extreme. But you know, increasing it a little bit gives the colors a little bit of pop compared to what it was before. Maybe I want to increase the saturation as well. Now you can see here from the original shot that her skin is looking a little bit orangey. And this is where you can go back to that like HSL. So you go to saturation, and skin is usually an orange, red, yellow combination. But if you can see here, right, like I decrease this a lot, her skin starts having a grayish hue. We don't want that at all. But to keep like the natural look of the skin from this original shot, I might decrease, you know, the orange by a little bit, just to make sure that I'm not changing her actual look and appearance too much, while maintaining the color of the background and, you know, the colors that she's wearing. And, I might go back and forth and, kind of look at things. Maybe I think it's a little bit too bright, so I'll bring that down, or maybe I want it a little bit brighter and, you know, mess around with those type of things. But basically, this is kind of how you'll go through and edit. The great thing about Lightroom is that you can actually, once you have a look for a certain shot, you can batch edit. So what I'll do with similar shots, if it's like the same location, so it's similar lighting, everything like that, what you can do is select multiple images, and then you'll see here the sync button. It'll ask you what effects you want to sync. Basically, I have every single thing selected. So what's going to happen is when I synchronize, these other images are going to essentially take on the same edits that I just made to this image. So, you can look here. This image got the same exact adjustments, and you can kind of look, and obviously some things will be a little bit off versus the previous image because maybe you adjusted your settings on your camera or you shifted spot a little bit. But this really, really increases the speed at which you're able to process a batch of images. And I'll go through this basically with every image that I have in here. And then, as I said before, you can kind of go through and rank your images. So some shortcuts, you can rate them to 1, 2, 3. Let's say I want to rate them to 1, right? Filter them to rated. Now only this image is going to show up. So any other image that I rate will show up once I filter it. And this is a great way to kind of continue that vetting process as you get into Lightroom and you want to kind of narrow down some of those final images. Exporting, typically you'll just export as a JPG. It's a standard image file. Basically, there's a lot of different ways to export and deliver to your clients, but one really, really great and free way to do it is through Google Photos. So you can upload them to a photo album. You can share them via email, and then they'll be part of that shared album and can access and download. There are other, different softwares and sites that you can use to deliver your images, but generally Google Photos is a super great way because it's easy. Some people use Dropbox or things like that, but that's what I use and it's worked for me. So no complaints there. But yeah, I mean, basically, that's the majority of the process. I think from the get-go, the really important thing is to set the expectation to your clients. The good thing is that people are usually coming to you because they see your style and they like the way that you're editing your images. Some people do set up contracts like, where someone cannot put their own edited filters on it, like once they deliver those images. Technically, like they are your rights, but because the person signed for them and they paid for them, they are their photos as well. Generally, I don't require that out of my clients. They just respect the photos that I give them and the final edited images. But there are some people who will unfortunately throw their own filters onto your images, and kind of sucks, but it's just one of those things. Again, setting the expectation of how many images you're delivering, when they should expect them, because there could be hundreds of images. I typically give myself at least 1 week or a couple of weeks. And that's typically the amount of time that, a photographer will have for editing these files. But that's pretty much it for the entire post process that I go through. Obviously, this is kind of an abridged version, but would love to kind of answer any questions or talk about anything that I went over during this whole process. I know it's a very quick process, and like I said, I can go on an entire other presentation about just editing. But yeah, we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, so same question. Bren asks, how many lenses do you have and how many do you typically take when you shoot?
Good question. So lenses and gear is definitely something that a lot of people feel like they need a lot of when they first start out, because they think, oh, to be a great photographer, you need really great gear. Obviously, we don't all have the budget to out of nowhere drop thousands of dollars on gear.
Right.
So, for myself personally, I've acquired like used gear over time. Right now, I only have 2 lenses. That's a 50 millimeter and an 85 millimeter, which are both prime, which means I can't like adjust them to zoom in or zoom out. That's because I mostly shoot portraits, but some people who shoot events might want like a zoom lens, just because they're moving around in tight spaces, and it helps to be able to adjust that zoom a little bit. And yeah, I mean, I only have one camera that I got used as well. I highly suggest getting used gear that's like accredited from, places that sell the gear. That way it's at a cheaper price, but it's also, in great condition.
Right. Well, one thing you guys need to know about Brian is that his career began in 2018 with a foundation created through his work in New York Fashion Week.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. Any more questions? Right. Would you like to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, coincidentally, it was actually with Find Your ID back in 2018. So it was a small show, but going back to the gear that I was talking about. So I only had my prime lens. We were in a very small environment, and it really makes it limiting for if you're kind of getting the great shot, and you really don't have space to like move back further. Those prime lenses can be really limiting in that way. Because I am a portrait photographer, and generally I'm just shooting one subject and we're in a studio or we're outside, there is space. But I would say when you're looking at gear, especially, just kind of think about like what you're looking to go into, and then base your gear off of that. But yeah, the work in Fashion Week was really incredible. I think going back to like what it meant to be part of that show, I think it's so important for photographers and creatives to really like connect with other creatives, especially in your area. I mean, there's still so many people that I work with from that show to this day. And it really, really helps to network in order to grow your business and like your career.
Right. That's cool. So Min asks, do you have your dream camera?
Yeah. So right now I shoot with a Nikon D810, which is, it's not like a crazy professional camera, but it's like, I'd say mid-level, like mid-tier level. There is like a D850, which right now is like Nikon's top of the line. I know there's also mirrorless cameras, which, I'm shooting digital, but mirrorless are becoming this new like technology for camera gear. So, I think eventually I might invest in like a new camera. Like I said before, I only have bought used gear, but I think as I'm kind of progressing, might make that jump to the mirrorless camera and invest in a new camera soon, depending on when the new one comes out. But yeah, saving up.
Right. Yeah. So, is there any, like, do you have anything in mind, like anything for your dream camera, like any brand you suggest?
I think it really depends on personal preference. I started off with a Nikon as my starter camera. It was like, I think it was like a $500 camera that came with $500 camera that came with two lenses. It was like great for starting out. And I would also suggest that for anyone who is making to jump into photography. Like, don't dive deep into the expensive gear right away. Like, really get familiar just with like the technicalities of photography. So learning, how to shoot in manual mode and lighting and posing and like all those things. I always tell people like the camera doesn't take the photo, you take the photo. So knowing how to do those techniques and like really learning the craft is the most important thing. I mean, I shot with my starter camera for over a year, and I even saw that progression within like my own work over that course of time, without changing any of my gear. So yeah, that's what I would suggest. But in terms of dream brands or like anything like that, some people shoot with Sony, some people shoot with Canon, other people shoot completely on film. I honestly think it's highly dependent on what you start off with, what you're kind of looking for. Each brand has like minute specifics that they're really good at. So kind of just doing your research and looking up and, talking to other photographers in the field that use different cameras and kind of figuring out.
Okay. So do you have any more questions? All right. Another question is, what's your most memorable shooting experience?
Oh man, memorable. I mean, the Fashion Week show was really cool. I think, that was a great experience. I also, just before quarantine hit, actually, I did an editorial photo shoot with like I think it was like 15 plus models. There's another photographer, a couple of stylists. I think that was really, really cool because it was a big project, but like seeing everyone with their own individual crafts come together and like work in synchronization with one another. I think that's like a really great experience. And it goes back to what I was saying before in terms of the importance of making connections and just growing your community of creatives that you work with.
Wow, wow, wow. So any more questions? All right, so I'll give you the floor to continue showing the rest of the, your presentation.
Great, yeah. I mean, that was mostly what I was wanted to go over in terms of like the post-shot processing. But if there's anything that anybody wants me to go over with like Lightroom specifically, I know there's a lot of like minute details there, or maybe how I kind of got into the field or things like that.
Okay. Okay, so we got another question. What's the difference between adjusting the tone on the scale or on the curve?
Good question. So I can go back to Lightroom and kind of show you what these things will do. So let me share my screen. Okay. So yes, adjusting the tones based on the curve or based on the scale. So really a simple answer is that the curve will give you a lot more control over where you're adjusting like different colors, where the scale will kind of like break it down on that more simple level in terms of the saturation, the luminance, and the hue of color. So again, showing you what I was showing you before, obviously the hue will adjust like kind of the tone of the color itself. Saturation will adjust the intensity of a specific color. Luminance will basically adjust like how bright a color is. It kind of is the same sense as highlights. So you can see here, I can increase like that specific brightness of that color, which also helps with skin as well. If you're looking to, increase shadowing or, give a little bit more of a brightness to a person's skin. If you're looking at the curve, it's basically, an adjustment based on shadows, midtones, and highlights. A lot of people do like an S scale curve. So it's kind of technical if you play around with it, but basically plotting out points on the curve and paying attention to this histogram. So what's cool about Lightroom is as you scroll over it with your mouse, it'll actually tell you like what these colors are coming out in. So there's blacks all the way on the left, shadows, exposure, highlights, whites all the way on the right. So basically, if you look at it, going from all the way dark to all the way bright. So you can see this image that a lot of the colors are coming out in like the highlights and the midtones. And the way you have to look at it is the same thing with painting in the sense that like, if you add different colors together, like blue and red, you're going to get purple. So when you're looking at an image, if you're moving these points up or down, if we're on the red right now, if you're subtracting red, it's going to be adding other color to your image, right? So I'll just give you an example. Here's shadows, right? I'm starting to subtract the red, and you can see that greens are becoming more prominent. And those are showing up in the shadows. So you can see like in the dark parts of her hair, like the dark parts of her skin where she's like covering up a little bit. Same thing goes if you like increase it. So you can see in the shadows, her hair is getting more red, her skin, yada, yada. Midtones is basically anything that's not a shadow or like not a highlight. So kind of everything in between. So the overall look here, so you can see I'm decreasing the red. So pretty much everything is getting this more green hue to it. Increasing the red, everything's kind of getting that reddish tone to it. And then I can reset all channels. And then same thing goes to the highlights. If you're increasing red, it's going to add it to the highlights. So you can see in the background, like those bright spots are becoming red. Decreasing it, it's becoming green. And that's the same thing with every single color. And the cool thing is that on here, it'll actually show you, as you make the adjustments, if you can see how the upper part is reddish and the bottom part is green. You come over to green, upper part's green, lower part's like a purple. here with the blue, upper part's blue, lower part's yellow. So just going through an example of like completely different colors, same kind of thing works, right? Like I'm decreasing it, it's giving that like yellow look in the highlights. I'm increasing it, it's giving that bluish look in the highlights. So some people really go deep into using these tone curves to like make their own presets and kind of giving their creative style to images. Again, going back to like what I was talking about before, my personal creative style is like very minimalistic. I like to keep things very close to what the original image was. I like to brighten it a little bit, add a little bit more contrast, a little bit more detail. But you know, really trying to keep it the same. That's pretty much all up to your own preference. Again, it's going in and messing around with it, kind of like seeing what the look and feel is and landing on something that you're comfortable with. Also, you know, kind of what I touched upon before as well, you can go into temperatures and tints, which also kind of works with those same colors that you see in the histogram. So I showed you the coolness and the warmth, but you can also play with the tinting. So I think I mentioned it before, like if someone is underneath a tree or something, they might have a really greenish look to them. So increasing the tinting to be more red or magenta might like take away that green. And again, as you're making all these adjustments, you can kind of see how the colors are coming out in the histogram above. It's a process that you can get as deep into as you want, as shallow into as you want. It's all based on like how much you kind of want to alter the images and create a style. So it's really all about just like personal preference on that end.
All right, all right. So our last question will be, how can you edit specific areas on an image?
Specific areas. So there's a few ways to do it. If you're talking about like editing out blemishes or things like that, there's really good tools in Photoshop, but Lightroom does do a decent job at like allowing you to do that. But let me just show you, again, I'll share my screen and show you an example of like selectively editing different parts of your images. Okay, so we'll come out of here. All right, so if you look up at the top here, there's a few different tools that will allow you to kind of adjust the image. So obviously crop, pretty self-explanatory. There are some pretty cool tools here for figuring out like if the shot is straight or if it's aligned or things like that, and you can mess with the angle to kind of fix that out. A lot of landscape photographers will use this to adjust their horizon. That's, you know, pretty self-explanatory. But the other things is like spot removal tools. So if we look here, right, like let's look at this like random part of the image. There is this little like, I don't know, rock or something, right? So if you want to take out any blemishes or like rocks or garbage, again, I try to make sure that those things are out of the shot, but like this could have been a random piece of paper that flew in as I was taking a shot. So the cool thing with the spot removal tool is basically it'll take any other part of the image that looks similar and you can adjust it to kind of get rid of that. So just to show you, it's very straightforward. Click on it, drag it, and some of these lines are gonna like not align here, but maybe I can drag it to something that is a little bit similar. And because this is also like a full body image, you're not gonna really see these like random little markings on the ground making a big difference. So if I show you the before and after, now that little tiny rock is gone. And you zoom out all the way and, you know, it's gone from the image and you really can't tell that anything was done to that part of the image to change it. There's also things such as these like selective radial filters. So sometimes people like to use it on eyes to like, if the eyes are in like shadows to bring out the person's eye a little bit more. But to give you a very brief example on what this could look like, right? So use these different type of filters. You can shape it if you want to like edit a background or anything like this. But let's say you want to bring out her eyes because we are facing away from the light. So basically her entire front body is all shadowed, meaning any color in her eyes is really going to be darkened out. Again, depending on like what type of look you're going for, I always like to go with more of a natural look. So I really don't mess around with this too much, but it's the same exact tools as you're working with in the greater part of your image. So things like exposure, highlights will all help to bring out the eyes. So if I do this like really extreme, you can kind of see here that her eyes are popping a little bit because we're compensating for the shadow that's kind of making them be dark and disappear. Same thing with saturation. I mean, if we brought this up like all the way, you know, it'll take the browns in her eyes and like really make them a strong color. Whereas if we go all the way down, it's gonna, you know, take all that color out. But to give you an idea of what that looks like, that was like a quick, not great edit, but just to give you a brief idea, you know, it can bring out some of the colors a little bit and help her eyes to pop. Same type of thing goes with, you know, radial filters and dragging those over your image to really bring out like different like exposures and colors and vignetting if you want to do to, you know, make the image pop a little bit. These are all things that you kind of mess around with in some of these settings below. So some people like this darker effect, some people like a lighter effect, but there's a lot of ways to edit like selective parts of your image. Again, it's kind of messing around with the tools and figuring out like what tool works best for what you're trying to accomplish.
All right, great. Thank you, Brian, for teaching us everything today. We really learned a lot, and hopefully,
Yeah.
I hope all the viewers like learned something about editing, and of course, I did too. So thank you guys for tuning in again into Treniques, and please sure to follow Brian at Brian Edsall on Instagram and visit his website, brianedsall.com. You can also follow Find Your ID on Facebook and Instagram to check out the different services we provide in the creative industry. Thank you guys very much, and thank you again, Brian, for coming on Treniques. See you guys next week. All right, bye bye.